Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. So, hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. Each episode will choose a single play, or perhaps even two, often a play that's on stage somewhere in the UK, and we're going to talk about it in more detail than you would usually find in, say, the reviews of a performance or a production. We're going to talk about the play's origins, the author's life, its themes, characters, structure, all sorts. I'm Douglas Schatz. I'm the host of the Play Podcast, and I'm doing this, mainly just because it's a passion. I've been an obsessive theater goer all my life. I might make a claim, if one was needed, to professional qualification because for the last 6 years I've been the managing director of Samuel French Theater Publishers, drama publishers. And in so doing, of course, I read and went to a lot of plays and went to the theater, and I guess I just can't stop talking about plays. So, for the opening night of the Play Podcast, the curtain rises on a tastefully but not expensively furnished drawing room in a traditional middle-class home in a small Norwegian town. It is winter. It is icy cold outside. Inside, we find Nora, a young wife and mother of three, cheerfully preparing her house for Christmas. A tree, a basket of foods, presents. Her bank manager husband works in his office next door. But all is not well in this apparently happy home. Nora carries a dark secret that is about to explode her and her family's peaceful and conventional world. So, if we hadn't already given it away in the title of our episode, you may have recognized our play simply from the leading character's name, because Nora has become an iconic figure in the history of theater. The play is, of course, A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, chosen partly because there are two productions happening in London this spring, a radical new version by Scottish playwright Stef Smith, currently on stage at the Young Vic, and another version coming to the Playhouse Theatre in June with the film actress Jessica Chastain in the lead role. So what is it about this play that premiered, 140 years ago that continues to inspire and challenge contemporary audiences and also playwrights? I happen to know someone who might have a few of the answers to that question. Is alongside me just now Dan Rebellato, who is a playwright, journalist, and professor of contemporary theatre at Royal Holloway, University of London, which sounds like a fantastic job, by the way, Dan. He has written 17 stage plays and numerous radio plays, published several books on contemporary British theatre, as well as edited the Nick Hearn series of Terence Rattigan's plays. Dan recently put together and hosted a fascinating day-long symposium at the Young Vic Theatre to coincide with a new production there called Reimagining Nora, which, as the title suggests, examined the enduring interest in reviving and adapting A Doll's House. Dan is the perfect person to be our first guest on the podcast, other perhaps than you are not female or a wife or a mother. Welcome, Dan, and thanks for joining us. So my first question, and this is going to be, I think will become the standard first question on the podcast, is where and when did you personally first encounter A Doll's House? And what impression did that make on you?
Well, I have no idea when I first encountered A Doll's House because it's one of those plays that is so much in the air. You know, it's kind of part of the air you breathe, I think, if you have any interest in kind of modern and contemporary playwriting. So it probably would be, I might have read it when I was in sixth form, something like that. Mm-hmm. I think, if I'm honest, that probably my first reaction was not to get why it was a particularly significant play. And I think this often happens with plays that are extraordinarily influential, is because their influence is everywhere. When you go to the original, you don't realise how significant it was because you go, but everybody does stuff like this now. So right. So you can't put your finger necessarily on exactly what this thing was doing new. So it's probably the more I read around it and got a much deeper sense of particularly 19th century theatre history, that's the point where it started to really kind of come to life for me, I think. So
do you think you need to know about its place in the theatre history when you came to it to understand why it's good?
No. I think there's a difference reading it and seeing on stage, because I think it took a long time for me to see it on stage.
Right.
I don't think I saw it on stage until I was sort of like 30 or something like that. And it was at that point when you go, I think I appreciated the extraordinary kind of propulsive power of the narrative. That was a thing that really struck me from seeing it in performance. In a way, it's slightly harder, I think, to get that sense of propulsion from reading, because in reading you can always kind of stop and look back and put it down and come back to it. But there's something about the extraordinary sense of a kind of pressure cooker that the play sets up in performance that is what is so powerful.
Because I remember, well, first, I guess I came across it at university when I did a modern drama course that was taught by Ronald Bryden, who was the critic for The Observer and a dramaturge at the RSC. And we had as a textbook for this course something, some anthology, huge brick of a book of Masters of Modern Drama, I think it was called.
Oh, right.
And I think A Doll's House was in that. But in terms of performance, way back in the 1980s at some point, I think I saw Cheryl Campbell do it at the RSC. And I've got this sort of memory of her in the Tarantella dance and her going completely mad and that really creating an impact. So in the symposium, which is interesting, there was a great assembly of people there, I thought, very impressive, well done. Academics, there was Tori Rim, who was from the University of Oslo, who edits the Penguin edition of Ibsen, as well as actresses, which I thought was really interesting, who played Nora recently in London. Hattie Morahan, who was in Simon Stevens' version at the Young Vic a few years back, and also Anjana Vasan, who was in Tanika Gupta's version. It was at the Lyric as well. And it was great to hear them talk about their experiences of it as well, and the academics. But I guess the question still is, what is the enduring appeal? Why are people still interested reimagining it as you described it?
I think it's Edward Albee who said that a great play should say something about the world and something about the theatre. And I think this play says something about the world and something about the theatre, which is that, it is a play about secrets and illusions and self-deception and self-realization. And particularly, of course, it's about a woman's coming to consciousness of her place in a patriarchal society. Yeah. And of course, those things, sadly, are still lessons we have to learn. Yeah. So, of course, I think for that reason, it has that iconic place in theatre history. It has an iconic place within kind of women's history in a way. I think it's a really, really important contribution to the history of feminism. So that's really important. But I think also what the play does is it teaches, or it taught people how to write plays in a new way. What I kind of mean by that, I think a lot of really great plays often do this, that they start as one sort of play and they end as another sort of play, and in the course of watching it you come to understand that actually sort of theatre history has shifted. I think of Sarah Kane's Blasted a bit like that, which starts as this sort of beautifully made box set naturalistic play, and then at some point it becomes something very different.
It's really crazy. And
you get a real sense by the end of it that actually the play has sort of said the kind of play we started with is no longer kind of fit for purpose for the way the world is right now. And I think that's kind of what's going on with A Doll's House.
So do you think people would have been aware of that? We can talk about the reception it got, but do you think people literally in the theatre would have been aware that this is something revolutionary, radical in terms of the way a play is made and presented? And
absolutely. Yeah, okay. I think completely. And partly that's because there was a sort of perception among some people at the time that the play was unfinished, because of course it ends with Nora leaving. I think it's okay to spoiler it after 140 years. But the fact that she leaves is so not the ending that the play's kind of genre signals have been cluing you to expect, that actually it feels like a sort of bleeding wound at the end of the play. And that, I think, is part of what's extraordinary about it. It allows plays to end in that kind of way, in a way that very few plays had really done before.
Yes, that would have previously, I suppose, have been all tied up neatly. Actually, Ibsen, didn't he think, as he wrote it at various times, I think he thought, there are suggestions that she might actually kill herself. She might actually drown herself in the river as opposed to leave. And at some point he had that in mind, because you do get that inference as it goes through it. I can't recall now how explicitly, but you think that's a very real possibility.
Yeah, there's a moment in Act 3 when I think Krogstad's letter has arrived, and she knows that her husband's reading it in his office, and she has it's really interesting because she has a sort of soliloquy, actually, where she's sort of speaking her thoughts out loud. She's not directly addressing the audience, but she talks about the shame she's bringing on the family, and she talks about the kind of the inky blackness of the water that's kind of drawing her. And it's very interesting because in terms of form and content, that is a very mid-19th century moment in the play.
Okay.
But it's the process that the play takes you through from that point on that basically strips away all of the mid-19th centuryness of the playwriting and becomes something completely kind of shatteringly different.
Before we leave this why is it endured point, I think it's interesting you talked about feminism, and I think Ibsen himself apparently disavowed the idea that this was a feminist play deliberately.
I think Ibsen was quite a cussed fellow, and it wasn't a joiner. He wasn't somebody who kind of thought, I'm happy to sign up to this campaign. I think he was quite an individualistic character. Oddly, he was very drawn to his friends were all quite conservative,
Oh, wow.
and yet here he is writing these really quite radical plays. But I think he also wouldn't. You could say that the play is in a way saying something about Nora becoming fully human. And so to that extent, he may not have wanted that to be solely inflected in a sort of a political feminist way, that he may have thought of that as being in a certain sense a more philosophical kind of evolution.
This is drama, not polemic and whatever.
Well, there's certainly that, but also it's not clear whether he particularly thought of the play as feminist. I think we can see it as feminist. I think it is a feminist play, but he probably doesn't want it to be just seized by one side.
Right.
If you see what I mean. Right.
So I thought we might chat a little bit about Ibsen. You talked about what he was like and where he came from, and therefore, where this play and his later plays came from in his life. Because he had, as you said, he was had an interesting life because he was an outsider of sorts, right? He was born in a small town in southern Norway. And then what were the formative things, do you think, that came out of his life?
Well, there are a couple of events quite early in his life that people often talk about, and I think rightly often talk about. I mean, one is that, so he's born in 1828, and when he was about 7, his father's business went bankrupt, and they were in a fairly small town, but they moved to a much smaller town. And also, when he was about 18, he fathered a child with a servant, illegitimately, of course, and it was sort of hushed up. And in a sense, both of those, I mean, first of all, both of those appear in the plays, sense of sort of secret financial corruption. It's there in A Doll's House, but also, the sexual secrets of the respectable bourgeois family are also there in a lot of the plays. And in fact, a lot of the plays have respectable middle-class men fathering children with servants, so there's a sense in which it's really animating, particularly the last phase of his life, which are where all the really, really famous plays are written, which are the last 12 great prose plays.
The bankruptcy of his family or his father, I mean, that must have been real trauma in a place that relatively small. So the stigma would be something to live with your whole life, I think. And of course, his sensitivity to the financial situation of the characters in A Doll's House is, you can hear the echoes of that. And in fact, having talked a little bit about the influences of his life, etc., I think maybe we should recap the plot now, if you can do that in a few words.
Yeah, well, the bird's eye view would just be a woman who thought she was happily married discovers that she's not happily married and has to get out of it. So that's the very short
that's
version.
really well done.
But
in one sentence.
The specific mechanics of it is just that 8 years ago, I think it was, near the beginning of their marriage, her husband was very ill. She forged her father's signature on a loan agreement to be able to pay for his treatment.
They go to Italy, right?
They go to Italy to recuperate from his illness. And she has been trying to pay this off, and she has been very successfully slowly paying this off over those 8 years. But now everything goes wrong when her husband sacks one of the workers in the bank that he works at, and that co-worker, Krogstad, knows about the forged loan, tries to blackmail her.
He actually loaned her the money, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So he has this forged loan agreement, and the dates don't stack up with the date the father actually died. So he tries to get her to get him restored to the bank. And when that doesn't work, he basically decides to go directly to Torvald.
Essentially blackmailing her. He was right.
That's right. And then to blackmail Torvald. And when Torvald finds out about it, she thinks maybe what he'll do is take the blame on himself to kind of save her. But in fact, he's furious with her, and he says terrible things about, "You're not fit to be a mother of our children." And that is the great turning point for her, where she realizes that he is not the husband that she thought he was, that the rules are stacked against her, and she makes the decision that she has to find out who she is as a woman outside this marriage, and so she leaves.
And she walks out on not only her husband, but her children. She has three children, which of course would have been extraordinarily shocking. And we can come to talk about how, whether that still seems shocking or how that plays out. But you mentioned earlier that the origins of this story are based on something true life.
Yes, so Laura Keeler's a Norwegian novelist. She marries somebody called Victor, in 1873. And quite early on, he contracts tuberculosis. I've read a story that she asks Ibsen to intercede with a publisher to publish a novel that might bring her some income to help his recovery. But Ibsen doesn't do that, so she forges a loan agreement. And what happens is the husband finds out about it, and he banishes her from the house. She goes to a psychiatric, she's in an asylum, basically, for a while. Right. And it takes a couple of years, but then I think she's eventually allowed back into the family. But anyway, Ibsen clearly takes that story, but changes the ending.
And he had, I think the extraordinary thing, I don't know whether this is apocryphal, you mentioned, but that he had a role in it somehow by turning her down, not helping her in some form. He might have precipitated the whole thing. I don't know whether he felt guilt and needed to write this out in some form, but he talked about this being a representation of women's position in society. There's a quote I read, it says, "A woman cannot be herself in modern society, since it is an exclusively male society, with laws made by men and with prosecutors and judges who assess feminine conduct from a masculine standpoint." So he had this perspective in mind when he started. Did he not?
He did. It's really interesting, that quote. Because it's a set of notes, I think, called Notes for a Modern Tragedy. That I don't think he intended to publish.
He was writing them in Rome before he wrote the play.
That's right. Yeah,
his notes to himself. Yes.
And there are a couple of things about that. I mean, the first one is that it's a really radical statement. I think it's a really excitingly radical statement that basically it's absolutely not a sort of bourgeois feminism that if, women just assert themselves, things will be better. He is saying patriarchy has systematically distorted what women are, and everything is designed for men.
The whole world's against this. It's just the structures of it are so constraining, and
and that's a fascinating and really quite extraordinary thought for somebody to have in 1879. The other thing is he calls it Notes for a Modern Tragedy, and of course I don't know whether he's still at that point thinking that she might kill herself at the end of the play, which of course might be a certain sort of tragic ending, that somebody's forced into a position where they have to take their own life. But instead, of course, he makes the decision that she leaves. And I think one of the things that I'm always really interested in is whether he still considers that to be a tragic ending. Not because I think he thinks it's a bad decision that she made, but it's a terrible decision, but it's just every other decision is worse.
Well, I think he did say at some point that it's a choice prefer the choice of female agency versus female submission, or somehow. And of course, that's what's made it so dramatic and iconic. Is it is a statement of agency of some kind.
Completely.
And of course, there's a outstanding question I've always had is, what happens to her? What could happen to her after she goes out the door? I mean, what were the prospects as an independent woman? Having done what she's done, left the family, and surely that would have been incredibly difficult. Was it realistic? Did it feel realistic at the time? I just can't imagine.
I mean, there are lots of people who would say no woman would ever do that. It's men who say this. You know what I mean? It's men who say that a woman would never do this. So, of course, there are some people who challenge the fundamental believability of the play. But I think there are a couple of things. One is that the mechanism that produces that effect of what's she going to do, there are two things, I think, really important things going on. One is this, as I say, this sort of open ending, this bleeding wound of an ending that doesn't resolve. That encourages you to think, surely there must be more. And the second thing, of course, is that the action of the play that I said, the way he starts as one sort of play and ends with another, is also the revelation of a sort of psychological state. It's this emerging consciousness through the play. And what that means is there's a new kind of realist psychology being invented for European theatre in this play. And of course, because we're supposed to, it's a way of writing a play that allows us to think that Nora is a real person. It also means we can follow that psychology out of the door in a way that a very neatly constructed, sort of well-made play of the 19th century, everything is so wrapped up, you don't worry at all about what people are going to do after the play. In fact, people are almost just the functions of the play that they're in.
I think it's fascinating what you just said about the psychological arc, and that we're given some glimpse of an interior life of this character, and that is the arc of the play.
Yeah,
obviously driven by some really dramatic, suspenseful plot as well, but it's the psychological journey that's most important. So, I mean, and in fact, this is of course what the play's, I guess, renowned and remembered and reimagined for, is this journey of Nora's. How would you describe what she goes through? What is that psychological journey?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very, very complicated question, because that is what is so complicated about
Isn't
this.
it? Because it seems like it's there's so many different levels, ways of assessing this. She seems to go from something childlike to becoming an adult of some kind. There's a sort of immaturity to maturity, because in the first act, she and Torvald, they're talking to each other in this really silly, childish kind of language with nicknames and these sorts of things, and everything she's doing is a sort of pretense, isn't it? There's a kind of performance element to what she does, where she pretends she's hopeless with money, for example, and when she's really, we know that she's having to repay the loan and interest by scrounging the household money, by working extra, etc. So there's a dissembling going on there. But she's playing this childlike character in a sense, isn't she?
That's the thing. I mean, she kind of goes from being an actor to being a person. What I think is so interesting is that I feel like when you watch it, or certainly when people watched it at the beginning, they would just have assumed we were getting the real Nora in Act 1.
Yes.
And it's only in retrospect that we kind of recognise all those things you were saying, those little deceptions that actually Ibsen very carefully lays in. The
details
hiding of the macaroons, all that stuff at the beginning. You eventually go, actually, there is something different going on, but she's play acting. She's play acting in a way that is going to, well, it pleases Torvald, but also sort of it's her negotiation, her way of pleasing herself. And it's the very end. It's that moment when she comes in her sort of traveling coat, and he says, what, are you going somewhere?
Yeah.
And she says, the great line of 19th century theatre, sit down, you and I have a great deal to discuss. And that's the point. The play,
yes, exactly, because she says at that point, that journey to maturity, she says, we, in our 8 years of marriage, we have never had a serious conversation. We have never sat down and had a serious talk. And by which she means serious, the word serious means adult in some form, of equals.
Yeah.
It's always been some form of play, which is, of course, the image of the doll's house. She's the doll and being played with in the doll's house.
Yeah.
And she's playing with her children in the same way.
And it's that scene as well, I think, is the point that whenever I've seen it, I'm always shocked at how utterly contemporary the play feels at that moment. There are there's that wonderful line. She says something like, he says, "Haven't you been happy?" She says, "No, I've never been happy. I've been cheerful."
Yes.
And I think that's
brilliant.
That's such a fantastic psychological observation about what it's like being in a certain kind of relationship where you go, "No, I've never really been happy. I've just been cheerful. So I've kept smiling." It
was interesting when Hattie Morahan was at the seminar. She, when we were talking about that, she said that, what was it about the character of Nora that attracted her, and how did she see it? And she talked about its range and the journey, of course, but she talked about how relevant it seemed that she was under such pressure. So she's performing partly because she's got all these balls in the air. She's trying to be the perfect wife, mother to the children, managing the household finances, and then increasing pressure comes upon her. And she says that this feels very contemporary. And in fact, at the time the Young Vic production was done, Hattie referred to them making a short film, which I saw the other day. It was directed by Carrie Cracknell as well as she did the theater show, and written by Nick Payne. And it's only 10 minutes, and it shows Hattie as a contemporary mother of very young children living in a London house and just getting ready in the morning to go to work, to get the kids fed and to the school or childminder and to the office. She arrives late for this meeting. She's just struggling to put her shoes on in the hallway and comes into a room full of men at the board table or whatever. She hustles back at the midway through the afternoon to try and pick her children up again. She's late for that. So she gets back home and she puts them into the trampoline in the back garden. And then she sits down with a tea or something. She's just staring. And then she just walks out the door. And you see her walking in a park somewhere. Her husband comes home, sees the children left on the trampoline in the garden. And I think this was a sort of clue for her performance, was that it was to do with that kind of performance pressure, and then a realization that, wait a minute, this is not a play or game I want to be in anymore in some form.
And that, of course, it's also how the play works, that she, because of all those little, My Little Songbird and, that sort of stuff, it gives the impression of someone who's a little bit trivial and shallow and doesn't understand the seriousness of the world, because he works in a bank and he does serious male things. But of course, what you realise that there's actually something slightly crazed about the performance, because she is, she's trying to pay off this enormous loan, and that's hung over her head for 8 years. And so actually this performance of, I am this carefree, slightly ditzy, young wife who is, sort of adoring and sexually available and all that sort of stuff, is at an extraordinary cost. And it's only when all of that is stripped away in the last sort of 20 minutes of the play that you suddenly realise actually that mature woman was kind of always there.
Yes, I think there's that wonderful scene, I think, which is also partway through the journey, not quite through it, of course, but the Tarantella dance, which I had to Google this, actually. I was thinking, what is a tarantella? Right. And she apparently has learned this when they were in Capri or something, when they were away in Italy and he was recovering. And so I played I found these little clips of music of a tarantella, and it's just frantic, very traditional Italian, but frantic piece of music at pace. And of course, that scene where she does this with her husband and Dr. Rank watching her, where she's basically lost it. She's just frantic and desperate, but it's really graphic as well. She partly, her hair comes down, and she's so, and it's partly an expression of her desperation, but also her sexual power is just explicit in a raw way that makes the men really uncomfortable, because they both are enthralled to her in any case in some form. I think he's Torvald does actually like having his wife available to him, and Rank, of course, lusts or in love with her. And I think partly through this, she understands somewhere, potentially subconsciously, that she has this power. Has never consciously really understood what it represented. She isn't fully realized as this woman. She's still been playing, in a sense. I don't know. What do you make of that?
I don't. You mentioned that Tore Rem, who spoke at our conference, was the editor of the new Penguin Ibsen. One of the things and these are fantastic new translations, completely wonderful new translations. And one of the things that emerges much more clearly is actually how Torvald and how sexual Torvald and Nora's relationship is,
Right.
particularly at the beginning of Act 3, where they come back from the party.
Yes.
And it's very clear that Torvald has seen his wife dancing at the party,
Yes.
and he's got the hots
He's up for
her
it.
again.
Yes.
He's absolutely up for it.
He
And he
is.
has this whole thing about, I like to imagine that you're my secret young
Yes,
lover.
yes.
And it's, it's a sort of, they're about, it's like he wants to go into a little bit of sexual role play.
Yes.
And actually, I think that stuff is, well, it made me think that really, I suppose because often we get Ibsen done in frock coats and Victorian period, and we imagine that the Victorians had no interest in sex, which of course we know cannot possibly have been the case. But I think actually I think it's equally possible to imagine that when she dances the dance, she's completely conscious of what she's doing, because remember, she's trying to distract him from the letter. She knows that he's in the letterbox, so she's going, this thing always works. And it's
true.
Not necessarily that the men are uncomfortable. What's uncomfortable is we're watching these two men lusting after this woman who is deliberately turning them on in order to distract from a possibly life-threatening revelation.
Also interesting scene then that follows where there's a possibility that she could ask Rank for the money to try and buy her way out of Krogstad's blackmail somehow. And because I think Christina has given her a suggestion that, he is enthralled to her. Don't you realize he's enthralled to you? And that therefore that sexual power she has, she could actually leverage even further. And she sort of begins to do that, but then he declares his love and in a profound way, and she backs off. What is it about that moment that she backs off, do you think?
Well, it's that thing that in a way she's facing, she wants to flirt in a way that has plausible deniability, in order to get something. But when he actually comes out and just says, actually, this is how I feel, it's like, I can't flirt in all good conscience anymore with a man that has just said absolutely.
Because it's real.
Yeah, it's real.
It could turn out and it will be real. And
that's
I
right.
was thinking about the Tarantella, how this becomes, the stakes are really much higher than she realizes.
That's right, because the Tarantella is the perfect flirtation. Again, because of course I'm just dancing the Tarantella.
Yes.
What if you were turned on, that's your business. I was just simply doing these complicated dance steps.
Yeah. So what about Torvald in the perspective of the husband in all of this? He's presented obviously as a patronizing patriarch throughout generally, not understanding her perspective, but obviously a man of his times.
Yeah.
And so not really surprising. And then, he gets the bombshell really, and he doesn't react well, it's safe to say. But then when she comes down and says, I'm leaving, and they have quite an extended conversation at that point about her before she actually goes out the door. And again, he doesn't really understand. He talks about her primary responsibilities as a wife and mother. And then there's the wonderful, again, iconic, I guess, reverberating line that, no, I'm not first, I'm a human being.
Yeah.
And he starts to just about understand what's going on, doesn't he? And just as she goes out the door, and he sort of feel like he thinks, give me a chance, I could change. Is there an element of that goes on?
Yeah, I think this is sort of what I felt very uncomfortable saying. This isn't a feminist play, because as I said, no, I think it is a feminist play, but I think I understand why Ibsen was reluctant to think of it as being sort of flag waving in that sense, because I think if you treat this as simply being a sort of a kind of feminist manifesto, then you would play Torvald as simply being the sort of ignorant, bigoted patriarch. Whereas in fact, I think Ibsen shows him as being as damaged by this marriage as she is in some ways. And that last, as you say, the last 20 minutes, I don't know whether I think he really believes everything or whether he's just reaching for anything he can to try and persuade her to stay. So, he tries the Bible and he tries tradition, right, and he tries, and then he says, maybe I can change. But at that point, she's so way ahead of him. She kind of goes, I don't think you can.
Well, he's also failed the test already, didn't he? When, the miracle she was hoping for was that he would stand up to the blackmail. He would, can protect her. He wouldn't throw her to the wolves or whatever. And then when the reprieve comes, as it does, his first reaction is, I'm saved.
That's right.
Nora.
Yeah.
And then, she says, what about me? She goes, oh, well, yes, you too, obviously. But then from then on also he returns to his patronizing best, where he says, don't worry, I forgive you.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll look after you. You did it, you were wrong, but it's okay. And it sort of returned to normal. And I think that was probably the straw that broke her back. In a sense, is that kind of reaction.
That's right. But also I sort of feel like, remember that his patronizing role is, of course, a role that she's connived in too. Mm-hmm. They have mutually agreed to adopt these very, very boring, regressive, conservative gender roles in this marriage. So I think there's an interesting question about what will Torvald be like after this play, as there is with Nora.
So the leaving then, yes, what comes after sort of thing. Now, we haven't talked about the character of Christina, who's Nora's childhood friend who returns, but is a widow, has been an independent woman and has looked after herself. She must in some sense be some suggestion or model that this is possible, that you could live without support. I don't know.
Well, she is and she isn't. It's really interesting. You're right. She's a professional woman. She's had to forge an independent existence. She's lived without a man. So there is a vision of a life beyond a marriage, I suppose, even though she's a widow. She didn't just leave her marriage. But on the other hand, she also has a very heartfelt speech about how awful it is earning a living, but there's no one to earn it for.
Yes.
So she's also a warning in a way of how difficult it might be outside.
Lonely.
Yeah, that's right. And I always feel like she's almost like a sort of way station in the play, that she, at the beginning of the play, she seems to be much more independent than Nora, but Nora kind of passes her.
Yes, because of course Christina goes back and actually ends up getting together with her, marrying Krogstad, who says, we'll be together, sort of, but as a contrast to the sort of childish relationship that we've seen between Torvald and Nora, I guess the Krogstad-Christina thing is suggestion is it's a more adult relationship. They're going to come to each other as equals, understanding that how to get by in the world. And it isn't just a marriage of expedience. There is affection, but there's some maturity about it, by contrast, I'd say. I wanted to come back to the leaving again, though. It's a fundamental question. I remember at the symposium asking and thinking about the leaving of her children. So I think in our day and age, we can all understand the leaving of a marriage, and of course that happens more frequently than it might have done then. But the leaving of children still seems deeply shocking on the part of any parent, and certainly on the part of a mother. And at the time, I guess people were, they objected in both counts, I'm sure. One was that they couldn't understand the ending because she wasn't leaving for a man or with the support of a man. But the leaving of her children, how did you think audiences looked at that? But also, how does it play today?
My guess is that actually time has slightly turned this play around a bit. My feeling would be that in 1879 and that period, they would have been more shocked at her leaving her husband. And now I think we're much more shocked that she leaves her children.
Yes.
And partly that's because it's very clear from the play that, she doesn't really do much with the children.
No, there's a different relationship, isn't there, between parents and children? There's a formality there.
Yeah, no.
We are all much more hands-on.
Yeah.
She has a nanny and a maid. And
there'll be a wet nurse and all this sort of stuff.
Yes.
And if you think of that Laura Keeler story, he banishes her from the house and the children stay with him. It's not an unthinkable idea.
No, because Torvald will have the staff to look after him. He's not going to be doing it by himself.
Exactly. And also I think it's more that it's a punishment. It was a punishment for Laura Keeler. You're not going to see my children or our children.
Yes.
So it's more, I wonder if probably in Ibsen's head, it's always a bit dodgy to try and imagine what's in a writer's head, but in Ibsen's head, it's a punishment. Nora is having to do a terrible thing that she doesn't want to do, not see her children. It's not that she's renouncing her children.
Right.
She's renouncing Torvald, and unfortunately that means...
Yes, and Torvald, interestingly, he suggests initially when he reads the letter and discovers about the blackmail, etc., he says, well, we continue to live in the same house, essentially, but not properly as man and wife, and you will not be allowed to see the children.
That's right.
Have anything to do with the children. And he's thinking, oh, wow.
Yeah.
But so she was already going to be losing them, I guess, in that sense. But
yes.
And I remember at the symposium as well, Anjana Vasan said, who was in Tanya Gupta's version, which transferred the play to Colonial India.
Yeah.
Fascinating, because it added layers of colonialism and nationalism and class and things as well, race. She had a really, I thought, wise response to the question about how Nora was leaving the children. In a similar way to the formality we just talked about, was that even more so in this circumstance, where the children were being brought up in a British imperial household as Christians. This is a Bengali woman of not much stature, and with servants again as well. So her line was essentially, they weren't really her children anyway, and they wouldn't have been in law, of course. So, the distance and the culture in which these children were being raised, in that case, was even more extremely not hers. But psychologically as well, it's still, as you say, I completely agree with you. It's turned it around, hasn't it? That our contemporary view would be, I still feel really unsettled by her walking out the door and leaving children behind. And so I remember asking Ati Moran what's her take on that again, and when she was playing it. And she said things like, well, of course, as it's in the play, that Nora doesn't feel she's a fit to be the mother, right? So doesn't that suggested in the play, isn't it, as well?
Yes, and, I think at the time... Isn't this the case that a wife is kind of almost legally the property of the husband and the children too? So in a sense, the shock is the husband's property turning around and saying, actually, I'm going to claim my own independent existence. It's sort of, the kind of legal discourse around it means that the children kind of aren't even directly hers. They're only sort of hers by virtue of her husband.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it is shocking, but it's partly because we now have a very different notion of parenthood, where we're expecting a much closer, more constantly affectionate bond with children than possibly was the case in the sort of last third of the
yes. I guess, well, that is true. Is there still a way to play it psychologically true now? Then, so when, to think you're not the fit mother, is that, and to walk out the door? Because the suggestion in the play, of course, Torvald, basically they're saying, you would be corrupting. As he talks about Krogstad's, who has also been a criminal, as being corrupting in his house, and the reason he doesn't want Nora around his children is she's betrayed some moral weaknesses that just is corrupting, and you're not fit to be the mother. And some part of that of her must think I'm not fit, but just as well, it's as much I'm not mature enough. I don't understand myself. I don't understand the world. I've been playing at this role as my father and Torvald have been playing with me as the dolls. I've been playing with my children as dolls. I don't feel capable to raise children.
Yeah, exactly. In a certain way, I think it helps the play. I mean, it intensifies that ending because I think that moment when you say you're not fit to be mother to my children is probably more shocking now than it was then. And so that thing that Hattie Morahan said about the range of the play, actually the journey you have to go through to turn that insult inside out and kind of say, you're right, I am not yet ready to be a fully participating individual in society is an extraordinary journey.
And surely I'm sure we can relate to the challenge of being contemporary, of doing all this. And many parents will think, I'm just not doing this very well. I'm trying, right? I'm trying to keep a job up. I'm trying to be a partner to my husband or wife, and I'm trying to, and then looking after these children, and I'm swamped. I can't do it. I'm rubbish at this. Not to mention the potential mental health postnatal or whatever it might be that can make it even harder, and you don't believe in yourself.
Yeah, but also I'm trying to imagine if somebody said to me, you're not fit to be father to your children, that would be the most devastating thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an astonishingly devastating thing. And I'm not a woman, I'm not at that time, and so on and so on. But it's an extraordinary moment. I mean, it's just a devastating moment.
So famously, of course, the play ends with the slamming of the door as Nora goes out into the world, a sound which reverberates as well, because it's such the finality of it, because Torvald has this moment where he almost thinks he can call her back, and then bang, the door slams. And it's a symbol, isn't it? This door has become something more than that.
Yes. I mean, Anne Votty, again, at this symposium, but she made a really interesting point that it's like the pistol shot of the more conventional suicide ending. But of course, it's
Chekhov's gun or whatever.
That sort of thing. The dramaturgy of it is fantastic, because it's not as if she just walks out of the room and slams the door. She walks out of the room and closes that door, and then we get that pause as she's going downstairs, where he kind of thinks, wait, she hasn't left. Maybe the miracle is going to happen. She's going to change her mind, and then you just hear clunk.
Yes.
I'm not even sure it says it slams the door. I mean, it's just like you just get a definitive closing the door. And then the great irony, of course, is that it's an incredible act of closure that doesn't close the play.
She's walking out into the wide open world. Yes.
It's a closing of a door that opens up the end of the play.
Yes.
I mean, it's a fantastic moment, and it's that framing that it's the two doors that it make that ending so completely devastating.
I thought indoors is a sort of recurrent symbol through it. I mean, they're always, the doors, I mean, the men are always in conference behind the closed door of his office. She has to lock that door to prevent him finding out the truth while she's having conversations with Krogstad or with Rank. The door that is closed, I guess, metaphorically to Krogstad's when he can't have a future, but the door is always open to Rank, who just keeps coming into their house somehow, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's just all over there.
And it's also, I think, I mean, it's a kind of visual dramaturgical component that is also telling us about all the secrets of the bourgeois home, because it's all the complexity of when a door is open and shut, and what's hidden and what's revealed,
and who's allowed to be here now or not,
exactly, and what people can overhear and all that sort of thing. Because actually Ibsen is fantastic at that, the way, because he sort of reinvents the bourgeois interior as a way of as a setting for plays. Again, the influence is so huge, we sort of forget that lots of other people, we forget how influential he's been on so many other people, but he's really, really brilliant at, you need to pay a lot of attention to the stage directions at the beginning of a play, of his plays, to think about exactly how he's choreographed the sort of zones of power and challenge and so on. So I always, when I read one of the plays, I have to draw out the ground plan that he decides that he gives you, because it really is very, very significant.
So that leads us on to a great question I was going to ask, which is that Ibsen has been labeled the father of modern drama. So the question is, what was so influential and innovative about what he was doing, particularly with this play? Because this is one of the early plays in his late career, which is, as you said earlier, all the great plays, Ghosts, Hedda Gabler, Enemy of the People, that we now think of and still do, but that were different from what went before. And what is it that was different and then influential? Why influential?
Well, there are a number of things. He's a father of modern drama. I think Chekhov has just as much of a claim on that as sort of in reinventing the 20th century, basically, in theatre. I think what Ibsen brings is he's one of the most successful people to bring a new kind of realism.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying earlier about the layout of the stage, these are places people would recognize. This is their drawing room in front of them, right?
Oh, completely.
And these people as well. And then a psychological realism that they must see as well.
Because I think we're probably, the effect of that is blunted for us, partly because, you know, they're now historical plays,
right?
But you know, that audience, you know, at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen at the end of December 1879, the curtain goes up and you have a room that looks like your front room. That must have been an extraordinary moment.
Yes, and as you said earlier, I think the psychological realism is that you wouldn't be used to seeing the interior lives of these people in this sense, which we now take for granted as what drama is about, really.
Yeah. Well, it's like, you know, if you go and see a play that has meticulously recreated the kind of room you're in, and then terrible things happen in that room, that's a fantastic and very kind of skewering. It's going to make you squirm watching that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I think, you know, the realism is important because it's about saying you should be able to tell the truth about the world, even if it really offends people, even if it's really shocking. Yeah. But then, you know, I think it's the end of this play. You know, you don't have to observe. You should not sacrifice telling the truth about the world to conventions of playcraft. And then I think thirdly, there is that kind of, he newly populates the world of the play with a kind of symbolic language and register and feel and atmosphere.
Yeah. Very influential. So we returned to the beginning where we talked about the adaptations and reimagining Nora for our age and how it's still happening. In fact, there was an interesting chart about when the productions of A Doll's House were most done around the world. And it was in the first 20 or 30 years, there were quite a lot of productions. And then it dropped off in the 30s and the 40s, came back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Which, as you know, you think about the feminist message, the resonating of that makes so much sense and is still popular. I mean, a lot going on now. So in the last few years, I've got a few of them arranged on the table here around us. There have been adaptations by Simon Stevens, and we mentioned Tanika Gupta, Zinni Harris, who set it in Edwardian England, and now Stef Smith, the show that's on at the Young Vic. What do you make of the most recent adaptations, Dan? I mean, the Young Vic. You've seen the Young Vic show.
Yeah.
What do you think about the way because that's a completely different take. She's created new time frames. There's Nora's in 3 different times: 1918, 1968, and 2018. Right.
That's right. I think it works extraordinarily well. I mean, what she's done is splintered the action of the play across those time zones, but she kind of keeps the structural shape of the story.
It's pretty much it's faithful to the plot, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just that, you know, you have slight adjustments so that, you know, 2018 Nora's taken out a payday loan, and 1968 has signed a credit card agreement that she legally is not entitled to do. But what I love about the play is she really gets the play and loves it and understands it. And actually, there was not a moment that felt that this play was not appropriate for the kind of contemporary age.
It surprised me was that the reactions of the audience are telling in themselves, because the laughter in horror, really, at some of the reactions by the Torvald characters at various stages is just incredible. It's just like, it's so obvious that people are going, you've got it so wrong. I mean, I thought it was a little bit heavy-handed, I suppose, in its feminism. There's some times where it's a bit clunky in terms of that exposition. And at the end, there's a sort of cry, a call to arms for across the generations, which, in a way, I don't think the play actually needed.
I think it maybe not, but I felt it sort of, it earned that. And partly, I think what was so clever about it as a sort of feminist reinterpretation of it is that obviously they don't have 3 completely separate casts.
That's right.
Nora becomes the Mrs. Linda to another time zone's Nora. And what that means is that the three Noras are pretty much on stage the whole way through the play. I think that's right.
Yes.
But also it creates a very, very strong sense of female solidarity that I thought was very powerful and very moving. And so it seemed to me that by the time you got to the end of the play, actually I was right in the mood for something that was a bit more of a random.
Yeah, I think the audience were pretty receptive.
Yeah. There's also a really interesting thing they do, which I thought was very bold, which is that she takes it slightly beyond Ibsen's play. So you actually start to see what happens to them afterwards.
Oh, that's true, yes.
But it's the 2018 Nora is the one who fares least well.
Yes.
And there's this, I can't remember exactly, but I think she's at a bus stop, is that right? Or a coach stop or something. And she kind of reflects that actually, I mean, I'm going to put it much more crudely than she does, but actually after a decade of austerity, the shelters are no longer open, and the kind of safety net that would allow her to simply survive have gone, and she's going to have to go back to her husband. I actually thought that was a really smart, interesting, and slightly terrifying thought about Ibsen's play, that the Nora of 1879 might have a better job than we do.
I mean, there's no doubt that with three later dated Noras, as we described, it suggests that that the issues are still live and have been through a century, and not as much has changed as we might imagine or think for ourselves complacently. And the one actor plays Torvald all the way through, so he, in a sense, is unchanging, no matter what his accent or financial circumstance.
And the moment where Torvald finds out about the forged loan, and has that horrible go at his wife, she had that in 2018, and that felt completely contemporary. And there was nothing creaky or old-fashioned about that moment of the play, without changing very much about it. That's why I thought Stef Smith had brought out so brilliantly that this continues to sadly be a play that does describe our world.
So I think we may have made enough of an argument that this play is still relevant. I hope we have, having spent as long as we have talking about it. Before we come to a close, Dan, there are two questions I'd like to ask you, which I hope will become a regular part of our podcast. One is, other than this Doll's House production, have you seen anything recently or read a play recently that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, I've seen there are two completely wonderful Carol Churchill revivals on at the moment. Far Away at the Donmar, which is just, I think for me is one of the great plays of my lifetime.
Yes, I'm going next week. I'm looking forward to that.
It's wonderful. And A Number is at the Bridge.
The Bridge, yeah.
And it's they're both terrific productions, and they reveal again just what extraordinary. She's a genius, and those plays are just extraordinary.
We must do her on the podcast sometime.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was my second question. What if you had to suggest a play we might do on this podcast, a personal favorite or an important work? What would you
throw at us? Far Away. I think Far Away is just is extraordinary, and and just bears endless examination because it's a wonderfully riddling piece. I think you mentioned at the beginning that I edit Nick Hearn books, Terence Rattigan plays. I think the Browning version is one of the most perfect plays ever written.
Rattigan's a personal favorite of mine too, and I think actually there's Ibsen has an influence on him, surely.
Oh, absolutely.
You can see it, can't you?
I think The Deep Blue Sea has a great deal to do with The Doll's House.
Yes, it's a wonderful play. That's one of my favorites. We'll come back to Rattigan then. So, thank you, Dan Rebellato. It's been great to have your company and your wise conversation. If you'd like to get in touch with Dan, you can find him by his website, danrebellato.co.uk, or follow him on Twitter. As we bring the curtain down on A Doll's House, I was thinking that what would be the appropriate way? We could walk out and slam the door, Dan, which would be a dramatic flourish. But I think it might be more appropriate to leave the door open, to signal that the future of Ibsen's Nora and the many thousands of real-life Noras around the world remains an open book in which there are many more stories still to be written. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.